Thank you very much, Cynthia. Some of you do not know me, but before I do anything, I'm going to take my jacket off. And I hope you don't mind. I don't even know what I wore, actually. Now I'm not comfortable. I was born on the 26th of January 1940, which happens to be Australia Day. The Germans invaded Holland on the 10th of May 1940. I was 3 months and 15 days old. The odds of me surviving was 6 million to 1. Just think about that. But I survived. My parents' family had lived in Holland from my father's side since the 16th century, from my mother's side since the 17th century. So they were truly Dutch people. The war changed all that. Now, I just want to go fast forward now to 2002. As Cynthia said, I had a triple heart bypass. I don't know how many of you have had this in this room, but it's quite an ordeal. The recovery isn't all that pleasant. It's 6 to 8 weeks, and could be very tiresome for the person that looks after you. When I was home for about a week, I was a cranky old man. I wasn't that old, actually, I was 62. Now I'm old. And I got more crankier as time went on. And Donna came up to me one day. She said, "You're becoming a cranky old bastard." And I said, "That's not a nice way to talk to a bloke who's sick." She said, "Why don't you go and write a book about your life? You've had an interesting life. Your upbringing in Holland was interesting. Since you came to Australia, you've done well, and you've got some interesting stories to tell." So I got in front of a typewriter, computer. That shows me. And also, I've been told to stand still here. I don't like it personally. I like to walk around with a mic, but they told me I can only stand here in front of this microphone, so I'll probably move my body a bit if you don't mind. And I got to typing and became more interesting. And that was in 2002. And I then started to do a bit of research. And then I recovered from my illness and gave it all away for a few years. I got back to it in 2006, gave it away again. And the reason I kept on giving it away was the research was so hard going. I dealt with organizations in the United States, in Israel, in Germany, and in Holland. And the Holocaust were the most difficult people to deal with, the Dutch. You ask them something, you may get an answer back a year later. And sometimes more than a year later. So that became, and those of you who do know me, I'm a very determined person. I don't give up too easy. And I just kept on going back to the same people in certain Dutch organizations and kept on asking the same questions. And even as late as this year, I got an answer back from a question I asked a few years ago. So now let me go back to 1940. We lived in a neighborhood in The Hague, Den Haag, which was a Jewish type neighborhood. My parents worked in the wholesale fruit industry. My mother worked for her father since she was 15. He was a wholesaler in fruit. My father was born in 1906. My mother was born in 1911. They married in 1934. I had a brother who was born in 1935, and I was born in 1940. And there we were, living in Holland, occupied by the Nazis. We lived in a flat, and the Germans, through the Dutch, brought in all these rules and regulations about what Jews could and could not do. Jews weren't allowed to ride on public transport. Jews weren't allowed to go into parks. Jews weren't allowed to sit on balconies in their own flat or home. Jews weren't allowed to go to school anymore. Kids had to be taken out of school. Initially they were put into special Jewish schools with Jewish teachers. Jews weren't allowed to go to doctors except Jewish doctors, and Jewish doctors would only treat Jewish patients. But of course, as the war went on in Holland, and I'm just speaking about Holland, by the way. If I say Holland, I know it happened in Hungary and Poland as well. But as the war went on in Holland, the Germans decided to implement the final solution. And Jews living in Amsterdam had to move out of their homes and live in a special suburb of Amsterdam. In those days, at the beginning of the war, there were 70,000 Jews living in Amsterdam and about 18,000 in The Hague, and a few spread around the rest of the country. At the beginning of the war, there were about 112,000 Jews living in Holland out of a population of about 8 million. Now that Germans started to round up the Jews, if you were walking on the streets, and I stick to The Hague, there would be razzias, which are pick-up things. I'm not sure what the exact translation off the top of my head at the moment. And there would be roadblocks. So Jews would just disappear from the streets. Then they brought in a rule in 1942 that all Jews had to report to certain locations, bring a small suitcase. When they did this, and so my grandmother on my father's side did, my father's sister did, my mother's 2 brothers did, and my mother's 3 sisters did, with their family, children, never to be seen again. My mother and my father decided that they weren't going to abide by these rules. And my father mainly was a big man. If you see my son in the corner, he's as big as my son. So he was easily identifiable by the Germans. He was a soldier in the Dutch army. He fought against the Germans in a place called Gravenberg, which is about halfway between Amsterdam and the German border. The Dutch managed to fight the Germans for 5 days before they capitulated and the Germans occupied Holland. He stayed in the flat, and my mother went out of the flat to buy food whenever she could, and always took me in the pram and my brother with her, because in case the Germans came right at the flat or she was picked up and things like that. And I'll tell you a good story about this. One day she went to the shop because it was pretty close. She and my father realised we couldn't last forever. It was 1943. There weren't many Jews left in The Hague. Not many left in Holland. Most had been picked up and transported to a place called Westerbork. I'll come back to that one. So she went this particular day downstairs. She walked a couple of streets, and there was a policeman there and said, "Hello, Susie, how are you going?" In Dutch, of course. And she said, "Fine, Derek." And I chatted a bit. And the policeman in The Hague knew her. My mother was the first woman in The Hague to drive a truck. She used to do fruit deliveries. So she was a fairly decent looking young lady. So the policeman waved to her, and Derek said to her, "Where are you going, Susie?" She said, "I'm going to the Waal to buy some caps for my sons." And he said, "Okay, see you later." As my mother had done the shopping and came out of the shop, Derek's standing there. He said, "What are you doing here?" She said, "Susie, don't look up, just look down, grab the pram and walk next to me. Don't talk to me, don't." So they walked away. And as they go past a roadblock manned by Dutch Nazis, which are called NSB, as National Socialist Bureau or something like that, they shouted to Derek, "Good catch there, Derek," a young woman with her 2 sons. And he just kept on walking. Took my mother back to our flat and stood outside the flat all night. And there's a good Dutch policeman there. And there weren't too many good Dutch policemen in Holland in those days. Because the Dutch police cooperated with the Germans in a very big way. So, she was saved, we were saved. Now, I don't believe in luck, and I'll just bring this in here, and most of my friends know this. I believe you make your own luck. And I have plenty of proof later in my life that you do create your own luck, whether it's in golf or horse racing or just in life. So it wasn't luck. It was my parents' determination to survive, not reporting to the Germans when most Jews did. And you can't blame them for doing it, because the consequences would have been even what couldn't have been any worse, to be honest with you. But they didn't know that at the time. So finally, on the 28th of September 1943, it was our turn. I just want you to close your eyes, all of you, for a minute, and listen to what I describe now. So there, my family, 2 young sons, 3 years old and 8 years old, father, mother, asleep in bed. It's midnight. Suddenly, banging on the door, boots running up the steps to the second floor, shouting, "Arouse, arouse!" And of course, my parents wake up. Open your eyes now. Just can you picture that? Especially as a mother. My mother was a fairly strong woman, very determined woman, jumped out of bed, and in the room was an NSB'er and a German soldier with guns in hand, telling him to get dressed. My mother had in her hands a bottle of baby powder, and she threw it at the NSB'er. And this is my mother telling the story to the show of her nation, the Steven Spielberg. And he said, "What'd you do that for?" He said, "Because you're a filthy beast." He said, "You make the flat filthy." And she said, "You're the only filthy thing here," and he whacked her in the head. Then they dressed us, my parents. They pushed us down the stairs into a waiting truck in the street downstairs, surrounded by Dutch policemen. The neighbours were looking. We were in the truck, driven to the local train station, which was only 5-10 minutes away from where we lived, rounded up onto the platform and pushed into cattle wagons, which were pretty crowded. I was a baby. It was a 2-hour train trip in the cattle wagon to Westerbork, which is a camp located in northern Holland, near the border of Germany. And I see some of you still have your eyes closed. You're not asleep, I hope. It's Westerbork was built before 1940 because of the German Jews and Polish Jews fleeing Germany and Poland that came to Holland. And in total, at that time, 20,000 arrived. And they built a camp to keep refugees. Familiar story? And what the Dutch did, they built this camp, which cost $1.5 million, and have a guess who got the bill? The Jews of Holland had to pay to build this camp. Then, when all this roundup of Jews came by the Germans, we were sent to Westerbork as a transit camp. We went there by train. Westerbork, initially, when Jews went there, when they all reported in 1941, 42, the Jewish population thought this was just going to be a camp where they were going to be held till the war was over and were then allowed to go back home. Little did they know. As a turn, and drove into Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, so etc. The railways in Holland were run by what's called Nederlandse Spoorwegen, which is Dutch railways, who transported for every train that they sent, they were being paid by the Nazis, and they collected millions of dollars through this. They, up to about 2 years ago, the Navy wants to score over Dutch railways, had never apologised for this. Now, a few years ago, some of you may have read this, the French railways apologised and paid compensation to the Jews for exactly the same thing. But they were forced to do this because the Americans said to the French railways that if you don't apologise and pay compensation for what you did to the Jews, you're not allowed to tender for any work in America. And the French railways did apologise and did pay compensation. Dutch railways apologised under pressure only about 3-4 years ago, and it was only a half-hearted apology. There is actually, right at this moment, there's a person, a child of someone who was murdered in the camp, trying to sue Dutch railways. It's in the Dutch press, and it's quite a bit to do. I had correspondence with the fellow only 2 days ago. So it's amazing how this all still goes on now. So here we were in Westerbork. Our time came. My father had a job driving a horse and cart, collecting food from outside the camp and bringing it back to the camp. He managed to steal a bit of food extra for us. One day he heard that we were to be sent to Bergen-Belsen. When he told my mother, she got upset because she wanted to go to Auschwitz, where her family was sent, her sisters and her brothers, 2 brothers, 3 sisters and 2 brothers, and their family. She told my father to go and see the German command and tell him to send us to Auschwitz. Fortunate for us, the Germans didn't take any notice of him and sent us to Bergen-Belsen anyway, which was fortunate, as fortunate as could have been. So we went on the train that particular day, which was the 1st of February 1944. I was just turned 4 years old, just 5 days into my 4th year. And we arrived at Bergen-Belsen and we marched from the train platform, which was about 6 kilometres away, to Bergen-Belsen camp. And it's hard to realise what a camp can look like. It could be a vacation camp, but it wasn't. There were no roads, it was just dirt. Toilets were holes in the ground. Barracks held sometimes 500, 600 people in bunks of 3. My father was in Barrack 11, we were in Barrack 22. My father was given the job of collecting the dead bodies out of the barracks, from the trains, and from just lying in the dirt. And then had to take them somewhere to be disposed of. The Germans, as a friend of mine in America wrote in the paper in the United States not so long ago, fed horses better than Jews. And my father managed to get food to us that he should have given to the horses. And my brother, who by then was 8 years old, 9 years old, 44, would follow my father at a certain place. They somehow agreed to figure it out, that he would stop and stand there talking to the horse in Dutch, but telling my brother that he was going to drop some potatoes, carrots, and my brother then crawled, picked it up and ran to my mother in our barrack, and that's how we managed to feed ourselves a bit better than most people in Bergen-Belsen. The Bergen-Belsen, just think about it, I was 4 years old, my brother was 8 years old. I'd grown a bit from being 3 to 4 to 5, 1945 because I was 5. So where do you get shoes from? There's no shops. that you can go to. My brother, who has suffered more than me because he was older than me, and still suffers today. I get phone calls from him, I get emails from him today. He's 83 now, where he has nightmares about the war, because he was sort of 8, 9 years old. Come back to my brother in a minute. It was his job, wasn't his job, but he stole shoes from dead bodies. For me, for him, shirts, pants, whatever we could find. In the winter of 44, 45 was a very severe winter. And we had no warm clothing. Parents who had babies or children that had passed away or murdered. Some people say today that Jews were killed in concentration camps. They weren't killed. They were murdered. Killed is when in a car, you get killed in a car crash or an airplane crash. Every Jew that died was murdered, whether it was of starvation, typhus, being shot or being harmed. So these babies that were murdered, the parents would swap the clothing with other people for food. That's the only way to survive. And that's how we survived Bergen-Belsen. When the war started to change and the Allies took the upper hand, the British surrounded Bergen-Belsen, and people in Bergen-Belsen were dying of starvation and typhus. Typhus is an infectious disease that spreads very fast. Thousands of people in Bergen-Belsen were killed, and afterwards by typhus. The British didn't want to go into Bergen-Belsen and get infected by typhus, so they did a deal with the Germans that there'd be no fighting and the Germans would surrender. Now the British were there about a week or so, and they negotiated these deals. In the meantime, the Germans decided to get rid of all the Jews in Bergen-Belsen. There was a Stark camp. Stark camp, where we were kept, was a camp that housed 6,000 Jews who were meant to be exchanged for German POWs held in England, America, places like that. So what the Germans didn't want the British to see is these 6,000 Jews in this camp who were, most of them were starving, close to death. So they decided to ship them out of Bergen-Belsen to Theresienstadt, which is in Czechoslovakia, on the other side of Germany, in the east. There were 3 trains. The first train, with about 2,000 people, was rescued by the Americans in the middle of Germany somewhere, on its way to Theresienstadt. The second train, which was mainly with Hungarian Jews and some Dutch Jews, did make it through to Theresienstadt, and nobody knows what happened to the passengers on that train. The third train, which we were on, is known as the Lost Train. We were on that train. We left Bergen-Belsen on the 9th of April, 1945. We were on this train for 14 days, being shuffled between where the tracks were still working because the Allies were bombing rail tracks and all this. And we got stuck in Berlin train station for about 3 days because the Germans had no idea what to do with this train. Eventually they decided to send it south to the River Elbe, and we were on this train for 14 days and were freed by the Russians, the Russian army, near a place called Trowitz in Germany. People say a lot of bad things about the Russians, but my mother has always spoken very highly of the Russians. And most Jews who were on the train would do the same, because the Russians liberated the train. There were 2,500 Jews on this train, mainly Dutch. A number had died, so by the time they liberated them, maybe 2,200. The Russians took us to this place called Trobers and kicked the Germans out of their homes, out of the schools, and put these Jews in homes, schools. And we went into school for the first time we were free. Guarded by the Russians who looked after us. You had to get your own food, which we only did by stealing. My brother became very good at that. There was an occasion when my mother was sick, and she was asking my father to go and get some chicken soup. Those of you who are not Jewish, which is Jewish penicillin. My father and my brother stole a bike, which happens to be a man bike. My brother on the back, my father, and they went on their bike to get trying to find some soup for my mother. They were stopped by a Russian soldier who they couldn't speak Russian. He pointed to the bike. He wanted my father's bike because it was a men's bike, because he was riding a lady's bike. We all know it's different. And my father didn't argue with him, of course. And they never found any chicken soup. They came back not empty-handed. They had some food, but not chicken soup. Typhus became a problem in Trobers. The Russians were dying, but it was very infectious. The Russians were dying also. The Russians decided to ship anyone with an illness, typhus, to a place called Riesa, which is a bit further down towards Leipzig, to the River Elbe. The four of us were shipped out of Trobers to Riesa, where we put up into school again, to steal food. My brother was very good at it. My father became pretty good at it. My mother and I were pretty sick. I was getting typhus. Typhus is an illness that if you don't last 12 days, the other way around. If you last 12 days, you're surviving. I was very sick, my mother was very sick. We were probably into our 5th or 6th day, whatever it was. So my father decided that we needed to get back to Holland. By then the war was coming to an end, it was May, and he hitched a ride with a Russian in a jeep, the four of us, plus another man with his 2 sons. The Russian took us to within a kilometre of the River Elbe. On the other side of the River Elbe were the Americans. We walked past the last kilometre, and we were exchanged. The Americans, the Russians at the river, there was a bridge there, exchanged us for 7 gypsies. The Americans sent 7 gypsies because we were close to the Americans. Took us to Leipzig, where the British were in command. We were put into school one more time. We weren't complaining about any of that. And I became very sick. My brother, who was in Leipzig, Bergen, came across an English soldier, Captain Douglas, came across here. And my brother told him the story, Captain Douglas. We took Captain Douglas to my mother, my father and I. British soldier took us to the British Army Field Hospital, where we were looked after by the British. I recovered. I went past the 12 days of typhus, and I'm standing in front of you to prove that not everybody got killed by typhus. Majority did. In Bergen-Belsen, in the last few weeks, when the British were surrounded, last week actually, when the British were surrounded, 30,000 died of typhus and starvation. Because the Germans stopped feeding the prisoners. And towards the end, everybody who couldn't cope died of starvation in Bergen-Belsen. The commandant was a fellow called Kramer, Joseph Kramer. When he went on trial, and I've got some excerpts of the trial in my book, I just remember this one passage. He was asked, did you know that people were starving because you weren't feeding them? I'm putting this in my own words. And he tried to deny it. And they then asked him, how did you know how many people left? He said, because I was getting a record of the people dying. he said, do you, and they asked him the question, do you agree that you starved these people to death? And he answered yes. And they hung him a few months later. He didn't escape. Plenty of Germans did escape, plenty of Nazis did. So now we're in Leipzig. We were getting better. We're now into June. And on the 13th of June, Captain Douglas and an American soldier managed to get us on the train to Holland. And I just stopped there for a second before I got to the Holland part. The Jews that survived, all Jews that survived, in my opinion, it's purely my opinion, survived not, as somebody once said to me, it was God's will that I survived. My answer to that was, it was God's will that I survived, then surely it must be God's will that they killed my whole family. And the person had no answer for that, of course. The reason we survived, and those Jews that did survive, was purely through pure self-motivation, whatever you want to call it. The will to live. And people can say, but the people who died didn't want to die. Of course they didn't. But you've got to really, my mother in Bergen-Belsen, I've got to tell you this story. My brother got into trouble with a German soldier in the camp, and he got into trouble, he was telling me lots of times, and they bashed him around a bit and pushed him around a bit. This particular case was the German soldier had a gun pointed at my brother. And my mother started arguing with the German and told my brother in Dutch to run away. My brother ran away. Then, and this is one of my mother's telling the story, the Kramer was on the loudspeaker calling for certain names and all this. This soldier put his gun down and listened to what Kramer was saying. My mother ran away. And this German then followed her and shot his person he didn't shoot at her. But he got closer and pushed her forward and she fell into barbed wire. And she cut her eye. And the German left. She managed to get back to Bergen, some Jewish doctor helped. Couldn't stitch her up because he never could help her. All her life, my mother would look in the mirror in the morning and she would be reminded of the war. By the scar on my eye. Just go forward a little bit to 1999, when I realised for the first time how hurt my mother was, how upset she was, and how much trauma she had gone through between 1945 and 1999. When I walked into the Montefiore, which for those of you that will not know this, it's a Jewish old people center, can I call that? And I don't get emotional too much in my life, most of you have known me. But that time, I lost it. And I'm trying not to do it here. When she was hanging on to the handrail, I'm not allowed to move. Hanging on to the handrail, and she didn't recognise me, she started talking to me. And she said, I just had a lovely word with Rosha, Nietzsche, and Nietzsche, which were my mother's three sisters. And we talked about our parents, and it was so lovely, and I just started crying. She was so hurt by this war, she never spoke about the war much. She started speaking about it when Spielberg, who did the Shoah Foundation interviews, asked her to do it, and I had to sit next to her, which I normally don't know. At that moment, I realised I hurt my mother. That came all those years. So we arrived back in Holland, 1945. We were put up in a convent near the German border, where the Red Cross processed us. And that's where my mother and father found out that all their family have been murdered. Everyone, close relations, 64 of my uncles, aunties, cousins, nephews, both sides of the family, were murdered. Personal family, my brother and I are the only ones that survived, are the ones that survived. There's one cousin that survived. He fought with the Dutch resistance when he was caught and was sent to Auschwitz, but he survived. There is one lady in this room who is a second cousin, second cousin Harry and Jerry, who is the, work this up, great-granddaughter of my grandmother's sister. Work that one out. But my father and her father are first cousins. Jerry and Harry, the elder brother, unfortunately passed away recently, are my second cousins. Now, I don't see much of Jerry, but I saw her here today, and I said to her, you're the only living relative, not only in this room, but in Australia, except for my personal family here, of course, my wife, but from going back to the war zone there. So the Germans did a lot of damage to families, not just my family, to lots of families. How can you forgive that? My mother always said, I can't forgive, but I can't forget. I agree with that. I have nothing against today's Germany. I have nothing against today's Dutch people. I still follow the Dutch football team. I still follow the Tour de France and bunch of Dutch cyclists. But the people of the period 1940 to 1945, and a little bit longer with the Dutch, I'll come to that in a second, is I don't forgive. But not none of them are alive. I happen to be one of the youngest survivors of the Holocaust. I was born 26 January 1940. Not many Jewish children were born between 1940 and 1945. I know some, but not many. I believe it's my job, in inverted commas, to keep the story alive of the Holocaust. It's my aim, I'm jumping a little bit here, my aim for the rest of my life to hopefully speak at schools, speak at functions, lunches, dinners, anything. And the story I'm telling you here today, because I do believe there's lots of people, including Jewish people, Jews I've met who are in their 30s, 40s don't really know a lot about the Holocaust. And they shouldn't know a lot about it, but they should know the consequences of it, in my opinion.